Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Assembly's live event recapping the 2026 primaries. I'm Emily Stephenson, managing editor of the Assembly. Before I introduce our other speakers, I want to go over a few housekeeping notes. And if you joined our live event inside the 2026 primaries a couple weeks ago, this will all be familiar. But we welcome your questions throughout the event, and we have set aside some time for Q&A at the end as well. To ask questions, at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a Q&A button. Open that, and we will be monitoring that throughout. We also encourage you to subscribe to the Assembly and to the Caucus if you are not already subscribed. If you are here to spend an hour with us talking about the 2026 primaries, then you are the target audience for the Caucus, which is our twice-a-week politics newsletter. We will put a link to subscribe to the newsletter in the chat, which you also can find by clicking the button at the bottom of your screen. And now I'd like to introduce our speakers. Today, we have Bryan Anderson, who is a reporter at the Assembly, Jeffrey Billman, another reporter at the Assembly, Carli Brosseau, a reporter at the Assembly, Joe Killian, who is editor of the Greensboro Thread, the Assembly Network's publication in Greensboro, and Chase Pellegrini de Paur, a reporter at INDY Week, the Assembly Network's publication in the Triangle. And now we are going to get started. I want to start with Bryan. Let's start with the elephant in the room. Rockingham County Sheriff Sam Page and State Senate Leader Phil Berger ended primary night 2 votes apart. With the provisional ballots now counted, they're still only 23 votes apart. So what happens next in this race?
Yeah, I was going to say we have two loud and powerful elephants in the room for that race there. It's in Rockingham and Guilford County between incumbent state Senate leader Phil Berger and Rockingham County Sheriff Sam Page. For folks who haven't kept up on election night, it was a 2-vote separation out of over 26,000 ballots cast. Now, Sam Page, he was ahead by 2 votes. That lead has since expanded to 23 votes, and that's after these provisional ballots came in and were recorded in Guilford and Rockingham on Friday. And from that, you saw Page net 30 over in Rockingham, and then you saw Berger net 9 in Guilford. So that's how you get a total of 21 for Page. And on top of his 2-vote lead, that's why he's now up 23. So it's clearly under the 1 percentage point threshold for a recount. Right now, that difference in votes accounts for 0.08 percentage points. So what happens next is this week we have canvassing. It's going to happen in Rockingham and Guilford County for their local boards of election. And then on Tuesday, March 17th at noon, that is the deadline for the second place finisher, whoever that may be, to request a recount if they so choose. Then we are looking at another week or so for this recount process for the state board to tell these county boards, here's your schedule, here's what you got to do. The county boards will then perform that recount. We could very well see a second recount, which would be a hand-to-eye recount. There's potentially a third recount that could happen if you want a full hand-to-eye recount. So it can get very complicated very fast. The other thing that's worth noting is that these candidates have created legal expense funds. This could ultimately be resolved in the court. So all the mess we're talking about with the recounts, it could ultimately be superseded by whatever happens in the state or potentially federal court system. But that is the latest on the Berger Page mess. So I'm getting some 2024 PTSD from that Riggs Griffin race already. So it's people have asked me, when's this going to end? My answer has been months, probably in plural form. So a lot of sleepless time to come.
I can only hope it doesn't drag on that long. Jeff, I want to bring you in to talk about that same race because you published an in-depth story today about Senator Berger, who's arguably the most powerful person in state government. The headline on your story was, "Even if Phil Berger wins, he's already lost." What did you mean by that?
That no matter how this thing shakes out, even if he somehow pulls out a victory and recounts and or some other mechanism, he's going to come out of this thing diminished compared to when he went in. And I think to go back to this, I don't think we have to call him arguably the most powerful politician in North Carolina. He just is. He has been for a long time. And there's not really he's sort of the nexus of Raleigh, like of Raleigh politics. Nothing gets through the legislature if he doesn't want it to. Um, and he operates as kind of he's sort of the center of the system. And he I think the reason why we wrote our story and sort of the premise behind it is that he shouldn't have lost. I mean, by all the traditional metrics of politics, he had endorsements. He had endorsements from the president and from basically everybody else. He had money. He had tons of money behind him. He had power. He had all the traditional, he had incumbency. He'd been in the seat for 25 years. He had all the traditional things that you would say some should make somebody almost invincible. And yet here we are. They ran this campaign. They lost to, or might have lost to a sheriff, to first time Senate candidate. And the campaign was really, Berger didn't come out of this going, he didn't go into the campaign going, look at what I've done for you. Look at what I've done. This is what I've accomplished. He spent the campaign trying to tie himself to Donald Trump, and sort of brand himself as this kind of MAGA warrior. And while his sort of allies, the independent committee that's attached to him, just really attacked and saturated Guilford County, Rockingham County with these attack ads against Sam Page, some of which were exceedingly over the top. And it was just kind of it felt like you had this kind of guy who's been like this political giant for a long time. It felt like it was making him look small. And I think that it kind of just became this no-win scenario for him.
And how did he get to this point where he was vulnerable to a challenge?
I mean, a lot of factors. I mean, I think there's one of it's just been he's been there for a long time, and once as a few people told me, on some level, it's that he's become a victim of his own success. When you start out and you have this clear agenda and you do it, then the things that you do after that become like harder. They become harder. They become more incremental, and like the people that support you are like, well, hey, what are you doing? And it's like, well, I did the stuff, but what are you doing now? And they want these things, but the things that you're doing now get harder because not everybody, even in your own caucus, agrees with you or wants to do things differently. So there's that, and I think there's also the fact is that Berger was elected the year George W. Bush became president, and he became Senate leader during the Tea Party wave, and but the Republican Party has since been taken over by Donald Trump, and these are different versions of conservatism, and especially the Trump era is temperamentally a different thing. Even if a lot of the policy views might be similar or the same in a lot of respects, I think the way they approach politics and how they discuss politics and how they treat other people is temperamentally different, rhetorically different, certainly. And I think on some level, I think Berger has struggled to. He's not always been great at. He struggled, I think, maybe to adapt to that in some areas. He's more of a traditional conservative. I think he's more reserved. He's always been sort of behind the scenes player, and sort of having to be like he's not like a fiery, out front guy. I think on his own, he's an efficient, um, tactician. I think, and he's very smart and very good at keeping a caucus together and sort of maneuvering and getting getting the things he wants done. But that's kind of that's I think maybe a different skill set than sort of being a champion for being out front and being yelling really loud.
And
And Joe, oh, go ahead.
And I just got to share this for folks to have just kind of a visual and to picture things. I mean, we're talking about a lot of money in this race. We had a story earlier this month, and if you add up Berger's campaign war chest with NC True Conservatives and a Chamber of Commerce committee that had assembled all rallying around Berger, you get to $8.6 million in spending, and that's through February 14th. If you add up how much in extra cash they had, that's another 2 million as of mid-February. So that is well north of 10 million, which is believed to have already been spent, but certainly 8.6 million definitely spent by mid-February. You compare that to Sam Page. And you look at him, he spent 55,000. So we're talking 10 plus million versus 55,000. Now it is worth noting there is an outside group that worked for Page, the Piedmont Accountability Coalition, that we don't have financial disclosures for. My wager, and everyone I talked to's wager, would be it's not anywhere near $10 million. So you had a substantial money gap. And as to the question of, how did we get this point? It's hard to argue that casinos didn't really impact this. And we had a story back a couple years ago where I was going to Virginia and I was going to Rockingham County, and there was this project that was being considered in response to a casino in Virginia. The thought from Berger and others at the time was, why are we letting another state eat our lunch money? We might as well be profiting from this industry, so we should have it in our backyard as well. And the problem with that was I talked to these people near this 192-acre lot near Camp Carefree, and they were very livid about this. This is for children with needs, with disabilities who go to this summer camp, and you're talking about putting a casino right in their backyard, and that was a very salient issue at the time. Now, I had asked, Sheriff Page, why didn't you run in 2024? Why is this the moment? And he had told me, I was running for lieutenant governor at the time. That was where I decided to land on. But clearly he spotted some weakness for Berger. And despite multiple Truth Social posts from the president, we're still talking about even just the potential for Berger to lose this race. That speaks to Billman's story of, in many ways, this has already been lost in some fronts.
Joe, you were telling us an anecdote. You're in Greensboro, adjacent to the district, and you were telling us an anecdote about some people that you ran into that helped you sort of understand why the support for Berger had eroded in his district.
Well, yeah, it has a lot to do with what Jeff said that, he's been around so long that there's lots to blame him for, right? I mean, people have their opinions about Sam Page, but every bill that did or didn't move since Berger has been in power has been held against him. There was a woman who was sitting behind me who was very upset about raw milk. And like I used to cover the General Assembly and I was like, raw milk? And Billman had to remind me, like, oh yeah, there was this raw milk bill. People are still mad about that. That might not be a majority of people, but you're not looking at a majority of people. You're looking at the Republican Party, and then you're looking at the people who vote in primaries. And then you're looking at the slice of people who have been waiting to vote against this particular person because they're still holding a grudge. And also another thing that came up that I sometimes remember myself, but I heard from other people was that they're still remembering that during the COVID-19 pandemic, Phil Berger and Tim Moore and then Governor Roy Cooper all did a video together saying, now that there's a vaccine, get your vaccination. It's the best way for us to get out of this. And at the time, Mark Robinson said, anybody who's telling you should get your vaccination, you should throw them out of office. These are the tensions within the Republican Party right now. And no matter whether he's got Trump's endorsement or not, I do not think that Berger effectively came off as a true MAGA Republican. It's just very difficult for him to do that with his background and his temperament and all of that. And so yeah, they weren't buying it.
Well, as Bryan and Jeff have both pointed out, we've got some legal wrangling ahead of us potentially. But Bryan, for some inside baseball, you did a little bit of reporting about who might be in line to take over as state Senate leader if Senator Berger were to lose.
Yeah. So this is our story that we're talking about the power vacuum that could be created. And the name I kept hearing from folks was Michael Lee. So I had kind of asked people, nobody's willing to really stick their neck out publicly at this point and say, if Berger loses, this is who our next Senate leader would be. Really, there's a lot of uncertainty right now. The one person who I could speak to who could be very candid is Bobby Hanig, because he's not running in the state Senate. He failed to run in a congressional seat, and he said there's not an heir apparent at this point. I just don't believe that there is. But from the people I spoke to, and with that caveat, Michael Lee, he's a name that came up. He is someone who has gotten the GOP through some thorny issues on, vouchers, on abortion issues, on Parents' Bill of Rights. So there's a number of issues where Michael Lee has played an instrumental role. And it's worth noting that you had Paul Newton, who was the former majority leader. When he stepped down, Michael Lee came up. So maybe if another leadership opens, maybe that's another opportunity for Lee to ascend. The one question mark for Lee could be that of the people who are really mostly being talked about right now, Lee is in the most competitive Senate district. His is likely to go for him, but it is a seat that leans Republican and is certainly not a safe GOP seat. The other name I had heard was Todd Johnson. That was someone who has had greater political ambitions in the past. He ran for a congressional seat in 2016. He's more of a quiet operator, but he serves as majority whip. He's in leadership. He's a consideration. Ralph Heiss, he would probably be the most establishment person of these three people so far. I've heard some people argue for Warren Daniel, and Warren Daniel also being someone who's very prominent, but Heiss outranks Daniel in terms of leadership. Heiss has been deputy pro tem, so if you're going to go with someone from maybe more of the establishmenty burger adjacent corner, Heiss might be your person. And then some longer shot people I've kind of heard floated around as Amy Galey of Alamance County. She's a staunch burger ally, as folks might remember. She had knocked on Sam Page's doorstep on candidate filing eve. And that's probably not going to help her win over the people that want to change from burger. The other one that's on paper that I have heard is Danny Britt. Now, Britt is someone who is big on the issue of crime. And if that is a big Republican messaging issue, like we've seen from U.S. Senate candidate Michael Whatley, maybe they look for someone who has had some strong support and alliances with law enforcement groups. I mean, Britt is the Judiciary Committee chair. He's got a lot of available cash, over $500,000 at his disposal. He's been a pretty good fundraiser. So those are some of the names that I've heard. Again, this is not a definitive list. There would be a lot of jockeying, and a lot of what we have seen has been kind of hushed conversations, but still a fascinating early look at who the next burger could be if Burger indeed loses.
We got a question in the chat that I want to ask Jeff because you touched on this in your story today. This person asked, how did Senator Burger differ from the late Senator Basnight? I know you addressed some similarities and differences in the story.
So I didn't live here when Basnight was in power, but my understanding is, Basnight, they both had sort of tight control over the legislature. But from what I've been told and what my reporting is and what I've read, is Burger has had sort of taken what Basnight did. He learned a lot from Basnight about coalition building and about keeping disparate parts of your caucus happy. But he also, I think, has run maybe even a tighter ship than Mark Basnight did. Basnight stayed in control for 18 years, even as his party changed and as his party became more liberal. It started out he was an Eastern North Carolina Democrat, as we discussed briefly. He was anti-abortion. He'd voted for Jesse Helms. This was at the time during the course of his tenure, Eastern North Carolina shifted from being a very Democratic place to a very Republican place. But he also had to deal with, he had urban liberals in his caucus, and he made sure that they got committee assignments. He kept them happy, and that really was the only way he was. If you don't keep the caucus happy, you're not going to stay as leader. So he managed that, and Burger learned from that, especially at the beginning when he had a more heterodox caucus. I think the biggest thing Burger did was he's maintained a very tight, controlled operation. There's very little dissension, at least publicly, and there's very little. There isn't a lot of at least especially until recently. There's been basically no public carping about anything. They don't leak. They don't publicly complain. There's not a lot of sniping, and they've maintained the Senate caucus especially has maintained sort of a unified front, and it's been which is kind of frustrating from my perspective, but I guess if you're running the operation, it's a good thing. And I think he's sort of taken what Basnight did and maybe run it better. I mean, I think they modeled a lot of what they did and what they did fundraising wise and candidate recruitment on what the Democrats were doing, because the Republicans weren't doing it very well up until the mid 2000s. they just sort of maximized a lot of the Democratic strategies in terms of gerrymandering, in terms of fundraising, in terms of all that sort of stuff, and sort of fine tuned it into a potent political machine.
And
We
just
got
one other difference with Bass Night that I have to say just really quick is that there's a fundamental difference in dynamic where in the 90s in the North Carolina House, there was like a 4-year window where you had control of the chambers, right? And even then, you didn't have a Republican governor. Now, we've had times since Berger's been in office where you have had a Republican governor with Pat McCrory and full control of government, where you've also had other times since Berger's become the Senate leader where you have had Republican supermajority. So the dynamics, there's less incentive for collaboration today than there was back in those 90s. And during that 90s era, you had a legislature that was at times willing to cede some authority to the governor. I'm thinking namely about veto power and how we were the last state in the nation, even after Guam got a veto before North Carolina had a veto for its governor. So we are in very different times where there's less incentive for working together. And I think the biggest difference I think we've seen with Berger than his predecessors is there's also more power entrenchment and maximizing your power through voting maps, through redistricting. And so those are just some of the differences that I can think of as far as Berger versus his predecessors.
We got one more question in the chat about this topic, and then I'm going to move on to other primaries because we could spend the whole hour on these two. But we got a question in the chat that said, "What can the public expect in terms of differences in legislative priorities if Page ultimately wins?" Bryan, I think that's a good question for you.
Yeah, I mean, I wish this was a race about legislative policy differences between these two candidates and we'd be covering that. But I mean, the biggest differences that Page has voiced is, the shrimp trawling ban. Page, I remember he came to the legislature in opposition to that effort that would have banned shrimp trawling along the coast. Now, Rockingham County is not near an ocean, so it was a very interesting time for Page to visit the legislature. We've seen him weigh in on that and protecting that industry. Another difference that we've seen has been with casinos, gambling, video lottery terminals, where Page has been opposed to that. And there's been some chatter in the legislature about how do we raise additional revenue to avoid a potential shortfall in the years to come. And that video lottery terminals and expanded gambling has come up as a part of an option, and maybe that's a solution, but Page is very much opposed to that. So those are two of the biggest policy differences between the two that I can think of.
Real quick, the thing about Sam Page is that, I think it might be also true of Berger. Neither one of these guys, I don't think, and especially true of Sam Page, is really wants to be a state senator anymore. Sam Page is not terribly interested in the job of being state senator. He wants to beat Phil Berger. He thinks he's doing the state party a favor by defeating Phil Berger. He thinks he's doing conservatives a favor by beating Phil Berger. He doesn't have, as far as I can tell, and I've had a lot of long conversations with him, there's not like a bunch of things he wants to go to Raleigh to do. He wants to beat Phil Berger, and that's the thing. He's done the thing. He's won. He's accomplished goals. I mean, I'm sure when he gets up there, he'll have things he wants to do, but the priority is beating Phil Berger. And that at that point, he will have sort of liberated the caucus from, what he considers this sort of powerful guy. And I think Berger, to some degree, and I've heard this, sort of whispered around, is that, if he wasn't, if Phil Berger wasn't, if Sam Page hadn't announced in February, there's, a possibility anyway that Phil Berger wouldn't have run for re-election. He just didn't want to be seen like he was being forced out. There've been rumors about his retirement for forever, for a couple of years, and I haven't had anybody tell me that on the record, but it's been whispered around for a while, and I don't know if he, you got to wonder how much he wants to do this anymore.
Well, in terms of what the legislature's priorities are, to some extent, that's not a question of the differences between Phil Berger and Sam Page. It's a question about the differences between Phil Berger and whoever replaces him as state Senate leader. And to Bryan's point earlier, we don't really know who that's going to be yet. We have some inklings about possible potential leaders, but we don't really know at this point who that's going to be.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and it's
Go ahead.
it's interesting listening to this because I'm reminded of talking to those people who were pro Page at the thing that I was at with the Board of Elections, and it brought home to me that some of these differences, be they cultural or political within the Republican Party, are also very situational. Because some of the women who were behind me who were pro Page, they were talking about, they were mad about casinos, they were mad about marijuana, and I had to ask them, like, well, are you mad that Donald Trump ran casinos and that he's pro casino? Are you mad that he's been the marijuana president in terms of, rescheduling it and being, and they were like, well, no, you know. And so, some of this is situational. It's like, if we're in a fight, I'm going to bring it up. And, but is that a deeply held belief that if your, deeply MAGA president is on board with that, you would not be on board with? There's no light between Donald Trump and Phil Berger on those issues. And so I think that that's worth remembering too. You're in a family fight, and people are going to bring things up, and whoever it is who comes in next, whatever part of the party that they're from, they might not want to leave that money on the table either from the casinos. They might not want to leave the weed money on the table either. And we're not necessarily going to see somebody come in, with waving that particular flag.
All right, let's pivot to the rest of what happened last Tuesday. There was other stuff. Bryan, can you talk about some of the other themes that you spotted on primary night?
Yeah, the biggest takeaway for me is this rage against incumbents, I would call it. We had 8 incumbents lose their seats, 3 on the Democratic side, 5 on the Republican side, would be 6 on the Republican side if Berger were indeed to lose this race. And for the Democratic side, it was a very easy story. It was, if you have crossed party lines, if you have voted against our governor, then we are going to kick you out of office. That happened to Nassif Majid. That happened to Carla Cunningham. And to my surprise and many others' surprise, that happened to Shelley Willingham. Willingham lost to Patricia Smith, someone who came in 3rd place in a mayoral race for the town of Williamston in 2023. Not exactly the most prominent person. And I talked to her earlier today, and she was like, I was hopeful that I would win. I didn't really give the mayoral bid much of a chance in 2023. I was a late entry, but this time I really wanted to hammer home the messaging of we need someone who will support the governor. And she told me she views Governor Stein as like the president of North Carolina, and how she'd never defect from Stein and would commit to never overriding a veto, regardless of the issue. So, I mean, we saw people who are ideologically centrist, independent thinkers, and more willing to buck the governor get absolutely pummeled on the Democratic side. The Republican side is a little bit more complicated of a story. We saw some more establishmenty people and some Tea Party-esque people get the boot. The biggest ones being Keith Kidwell. He is, if there's one incumbent that many House Republican lawmakers would have wanted out of office, Keith Kidwell probably would have been at the top of the list. I mean, he was vocal about the shrimp trawling issue. He is the House Freedom Caucus leader. He's been a thorn in the side of GOP leadership for many, many years. And he ended up losing to someone who had the backing of Representative Jimmy Dixon, which is notable. So that was probably your one establishmenty win if you're House Republicans. But you're also surprised about Caroline Eason. I talked to her. She had defeated Kelly Hastings. That was a race practically nobody had on their radar, but hopefully attendees who were here for the last event will know there was one person who had it on their radar. And Eason told me, she just wanted to have some representation for the district that she thought was lacking. And she's a pharmacist. She has that background. She's hoping to lower prescription drug costs. And so you had a lot of interesting dynamics on the Republican side. The Democratic side was a little bit more easy of a trend.
Well, while we're talking about Democrats, I want to bring Chase in. You wrote before the primary about the 4th congressional district race between Valerie Foushee and Nida Alam. Can you talk about what we learned from that race about the National Democratic Party, the state of the North Carolina Democratic Party, or even just changes in the district?
Yeah, I wish I had a more concrete answer for you. This election in the 4th district, which covers part of the Triangle, is maybe the most progressive district in North Carolina, one of the most progressive districts in the South. And we had seen this election as sort of a referendum on not really a referendum, as a contest between this sort of younger, more rock the boat wing of the party, not necessarily more progressive, but the sort of David Hogg wing of, if you're a lazy incumbent, you're going to be challenged and you're going to be voted out. Between that wing and then the experienced, maybe more measured, Valerie Fouché type. And ultimately, the election came down to 1%, not quite as close as the other race we've been talking about. But the candidates were separated by about 1,000 votes by the end. And so really the most concrete thing I could say is that of the people who voted, about 49% of them bubbled in the Valerie Fouché bubble, and about 48% of them bubbled in the Nida Alam bubble. They were pretty evenly matched across the district, except for Chatham County, where Valerie Fouché had an advantage because she had represented, I believe, that part of the district before in her either state house or Senate career. Even in Durham, where we kind of expected Nida Alam to take a larger lead because she's a current county commissioner, she's been doing the work here for a few years. They were pretty even. They were, 50-40 or 40-40 in all parts of the district, except for Chatham. Did we learn anything about Democrats? Money is definitely important. 4 years ago, when these two squared off the first time, Valerie Fouché beat Nida Alam by about 9 points. And Nida chalks that up to the spending that went into that race from outside sources. So this year, when she launched, she got all of this support from groups like David Hogg and Leaders We Deserve and Justice Democrats trying to push out older incumbents. And by the end, Valerie Fouché had gotten a bunch of money from Anthropic in the last week. Kind of a lot of proxy battles going on here. But ultimately, they were roughly evenly matched in terms of spending. And had Nida Alam not raised that much money, I don't think she would have been able to get within 1%. I would say my other big takeaway is just that momentum doesn't necessarily equal a victory. I think if you were on the ground in the 4th district for the past few months, you have been seeing so much Nida Alam buzz. If you're in the Bull City Reddit, you've seen all of this internal drama where the moderators created a whole new politics thread because everyone got tired of people posting about how great Nida Alam is and how we need to vote out Valerie Fouché. If you were in Apex, you would have seen all of this buzz about the data center because Nida's campaign helped push the data center into the mainstream. Kind of at every step of the way, I would say she outmaneuvered Valerie Fouché on communications and on framing. And it seems like Valerie Fouché was playing a lot of catch up. She had Bernie Sanders here for a absolutely packed Durham Convention Center, hundreds of people, wall to wall. The overflow room was full. There was all of this buzz, and then come election day, she ends up 1 point below Valerie Fouché. I'll wrap it up with just on election night, Nida Alam had a watch party at the Fruit in Durham, which if you've ever been to the Fruit for not an election party, sort of the scene and the vibe there. She had a DJ, she had local candidates for school board, there was all this stuff going on. Valerie Fouché had a quiet watch party in downtown Hillsboro, which lovely spot, not exactly, the most bumping part of North Carolina. It was a private party, reporters were not, despite their best efforts, invited. So there's this, view of momentum. It's easy to get into this sort of bubble, but at the end of the day, it might not impact all that much how voters go. I spoke to Fouché last week. I asked if, that winning with 49%, if that was a wake-up call or, a sort of message or a reflection on her first 2 terms. She said, I don't think so. So it sounds like she's pretty, set in what she's been doing. And it sounds like she'll be doing that for 2 more years or so.
Well, we just popped the link to Chase's story about his interview with Fouché into the chat. So check that out for sure. And I want to remind you again, if you want to ask questions, we're getting some good questions. So thank you for asking questions. If you have one you'd like to ask, the Q&A button is at the bottom of your screen, and I am keeping track of those. While we're on the subject of Democrats, I wanted to ask Joe about a race that we talked about when we did the pre-primary event. We talked about State Rep Amanda Cook, who was appointed to replace Cecil Brockman in the triad, and we were curious whether she would win the primary since she had been appointed to that spot. She ultimately did win that primary. What were you tracking in that race, and what has the community reaction been since the primary?
Well, when we talked previously, I brought up that, this district was created as we see it now in 1985, as a toddler. And since then, everybody who has represented that district has been a black Democrat. Amanda Cook is a white Democrat, and there has been some consternation there. And she ended up winning, but she ended up winning with like 42%. Angie Williams McMichael had about 30%. Joe Alston, 16%. Bruce Davis pulling up the rear with not quite 12%. But there were a lot of people saying, like, if we had just, and by we, they mean black Democrats, gotten behind one candidate, there would be a black Democrat in this seat right now. We ended up splitting the vote. If Angie Williams McMichael had gotten half of what Joe Alston got, if she'd gotten half of, a quarter of that and a quarter of Bruce Davis's votes, then perhaps she'd be in the seat. So there's been some consternation over that, and it's not just a race thing for race's sake. There are some ideological issues here that they don't agree on. I mean, the last two people who've been in that seat, Cecil Brockman and before that Marcus Brandon, broke with sort of the Democratic orthodoxy on charter schools and on vouchers for private schools. And there are a not insignificant number of black Democrats across the state in that district who feel that the public school system continues to fail their kids, continues to over police their kids, continues to expel their kids at larger rates, continues to have worse outcomes for their neighborhoods, for their kids, for their communities. Why can't we try something else? And as Bryan was saying, if you're in this particular election, if you're against Democratic orthodoxy, if you perhaps helped to overturn the veto of a Democratic governor, it really didn't go your way. And so that district has changed too. I mean, if you look demographically at that district, it is not a majority black district. It's, anymore. It's, it's a majority minority district, but, it fluctuates from like 35% black, 40% white, Hispanic representation coming up, Asian, multiracial. And, there has to be some coalitions if this gets turned into a, black white thing, and that's the only thing. And there aren't, serious, deep, and varied ideological differences, then the race is going to end up looking like this. And the question, of course, will always be: could Amanda Cook have won this had she not been put in the seat in the first place? Had she not essentially had a head start? Had she not been able to argue, I've done this, I'm in the seat now, I'm doing it, and had the time to do that after Brockman went to jail. So we're not going to know. It's a sliding doors kind of a question.
We haven't even talked about what's probably going to be the marquee race in the state, maybe the country, in November, which is the U.S. Senate race, which is now in general election mode with the two candidates we thought it would be all along. Former Governor Roy Cooper didn't have much of a primary contest on the Democratic side, but Michael Whatley faced several challengers. Carli, you have written about this race and also reported on Whatley in the past. How did he do in this primary, and how is he positioned going into the general election?
Well, I think he did about as well as some previously Trump endorsed candidates. I think it would have. I think some people expected him to do better with as much of a. Sorry about the baby. With as much of millions of dollars as went into the race. I think that he obviously had many more people competing against him than Cooper did. Some of those candidates I've written about before, Don Brown and Michelle Morrow, were kind of campaigning as the anti-establishment candidates in that race. And some people I wondered if Michelle Morrow would do better than she did. I think the fact that she was in the middle of a separation with her husband hurt her, running as a Christian conservative and as a woman in particular. I think that may have hurt her among some of the folks who supported her in the past when she ran for superintendent of public instruction. I think also Don Brown started much earlier than she did. I wonder what would have happened had Michelle Morrow put her name in officially a lot earlier on. She just wasn't able to coalesce the support in the time she had.
And
Thinking about the general election, since we're launching into that mode, I told y'all a few of y'all the other day, I was talking to a friend who's a reporter in Washington, D.C., who said, is this Senate race just all about healthcare right now? And I said, honestly, I mostly hear about crime and who is worse at handling hurricanes. Not hearing much about healthcare at all. So anybody could take this, but what are y'all expecting the general election race in that marquee Senate race to focus on?
well, I mean, first, I just had to highlight my favorite part of the Senate story that Carli had, where it talked about Michelle Morrow's chances, and my favorite part of it had to be this part where it's like Morrow was at this Franklin County event, and then there were five attendees. One of them is Carli. One of them is like the chair of the event. There's two residents and her campaign manager. I mean, if that doesn't tell you like the downfall in the shifted momentum that you saw from Morrow, I don't know what will. But then to your question of what happens in the general election, I think the messaging we have seen so far has just been campaigns and Hurricane Helene relief. And for Cooper, what he has to answer for is you're the governor when Hurricane Helene happens, and there's many residents who feel they were abandoned. They feel there was a slow response. Communications went down. It was very difficult to have support. And there's also NCORE that Cooper had that many see as failing in other parts of the state for previous hurricanes in rebuilding homes quickly enough. And that was one thing that Governor Stein, when he took office, had basically dismantled that Office of Recovery and Resilience there. And then for Watley on the hurricane side, it's if you're a member of the FEMA Review Council, where's that report? It's been a long time since Helene. Where is the fundraising? There's this title of Helene Recovery Czar, and Watley has said, that's a made-up title the Democrats have used. And then privately, like a couple weeks later, Watley told people that he was the Helene Recovery Czar. So, title and semantics aside, there's certainly a track record that both people have to answer for. If you're the governor, you're the most powerful person in the state. If you're Watley, you have the president's ear, and a lot of federal support is needed in Western North Carolina still. The thing both I think agree on is that with Kristi Noem no longer there and Mark Wayne Mullen now set to take up for the Department of Homeland Security, that there's some optimism that funds will start getting to Western North Carolina a little bit more quickly than they had under Noem. So that's the hope that both candidates have in this race. Crime we're going to see as a big issue. Jeffrey Billman had a really good story, and Michael Hewlett's also reported on it of just what is and isn't accurate about the claims Republicans have made about DeCarlos Brown Jr., who allegedly murdered Irina Zarutska, the Ukrainian refugee. And so we're going to see a lot of negative advertising on that messaging. But Cooper has really tried in recent weeks to hammer home this affordability message with gas prices rising in light of the strikes against Iran. So Cooper is really trying to talk about affordability now, whereas when President Biden was in office and Kamala Harris was running, we didn't see that affordability message as central to Democrats as they are now.
We got a
another
question.
thing-
Oh, go ahead, Carli.
Sorry, I think another thing to observe is many more people chose to vote in the Democratic primary for this race than in the Republican primary. And that may be an indicator of an uphill climb for Watley in terms of enthusiasm. I know a lot of the grassroots leaders on the Republican side that I spoke to during the primary were saying that they anticipated that being a problem for Watley due to some historical disagreements with Watley over open, whether primaries ought to be open or closed, and how he ran a party election in 2023 amid a lot of talk about election integrity in the country, but in the Republican Party as well. And so I think, there may be some challenges with Watley in animating what we think of as the Republican base. I also think that there another place that he was weak, I think, especially compared to Don Brown, was he had backed vaccines in the midst of the COVID pandemic, and Brown was and Michelle Morrow were talking about that during the campaign. So I think there's several things in his it caught my attention during his speech the night of the primaries. His after it was clear that he won, he was talking about all the grassroots volunteers who helped him. And I think that was an effort to sort of try to win them over to his side and sort of imply that he did in fact have the grassroots support. So it's a question I'll be watching.
Carli, somebody asked in the Q&A if you think we will see Michelle Morrow run again or something.
I would expect so. I think she's really looking for some sort of outlet in politics. I don't know whether that'll be a paid position or another elected office, but I doubt that she will give up that quest. It'll be interesting to see whether she kind of reinvigorates her dark money group, her nonprofit in the education space, or whether she seeks some sort of other outlet.
I would throw in, and maybe just, got to shout out the triangle here, but I would be curious to see the turnout in the triangle in this Senate race. I know that in 2024, there was this sort of local Democrat argument that, okay, if Democrats can't win over other parts of the state, maybe they can just juice turnout in Durham so much. And in, Carrboro and Durham, where Kamala Harris won with like 70-80% of the vote, maybe that can, balance out some of those other areas. And I think, both candidates in this NCO4 primary pretty quickly we're both pretty quickly ready to pivot to, if you're a local Democrat and you're mad, which there are a lot of here, and they are very mad, then this November Senate election is your chance to do something about, this laundry list of things that you might be mad about right now. So I'd be curious to see it turn out in these areas.
Bryan, I want to jump real quick to one other race that turned out roughly as we expected, which is in the first congressional district. Lori Buckout is in a rematch now with Congressman Don Davis, but the district is very different. It's much more favorable to Republicans this time around. So, but the primary was pretty close. Do you think that race in November is going to play out like we've expected since the redistricting last fall? Or did you see anything that makes you think that race is going to be more competitive?
Well, I mean, I do think it's going to be competitive. Whether or not it's as competitive as the last cycle remains to be seen, where Buckout had lost by less than 2 percentage points to Don Davis. The district has since been redrawn to a Trump plus 12, basically. So Davis has his work cut out for him. It's not going to take a complete blue wave for Davis to win. But, there is the power of incumbency. If you're Representative Don Davis, you can tout money going into your district. You can show up with checks. You can do certain things as a sitting member of Congress to get attention that you just can't if you are a challenger. And one of the tough things that Lori Buckout has is with name ID. She is someone who has only lived in Eastern North Carolina for about 5 years since moving to a multi-million-dollar home in Edenton. She's been criticized by her primary opponents as out of touch with the voters, and the district has since been reconfigured. But despite those obstacles and the fact that Buckout had far less time to campaign, like months less time to campaign than her primary opponents who had been in the race for much longer, she came out on top. So, I mean, that does say something about the strength of your candidacy, the importance of having money and self-financing behind you. So if you are looking at this on paper, you have to give the slight edge to Buckout today. But Don Davis is, I wouldn't count him out. He's still got a decent shot of winning, and we're going to see a lot of spending, especially since there's frankly not many competitive congressional races nationwide. So if you're going to put your money to work somewhere in North Carolina, this isn't the only somewhat competitive district, but this is the race to watch congressionally.
And then just really quickly before we open it up to more questions, and please send us your questions if you have them. We had talked sort of before the primaries about some changes in the voting processes that had gotten some attention. Republicans are now overseeing the state and county election boards. The state legislature changed the law to give less time to cure provisional ballots if you have to file a provisional ballot at your polling place. And then I feel like we're all still sort of getting used to the voter ID requirements. So Bryan, you're sort of our election processes guy. How do you feel like this all played out? How did the election, the workings of the election itself go?
I mean, for the Burger page race, it remains to be seen still. We still have some more processes to go, but so far, uh, from what we have seen, it's gone fairly smoothly. There have been a handful of reports of intimidation or questionable campaign tactics. That's kind of always the case any election you have. But to your point of what has changed, what's different is there was a bill called SB 382. It was a 132-page bill, and about 11 pages of it actually had anything to do with Hurricane Helene relief. Instead, the bill largely focused on taking power from Democrats and putting them into GOP hands. So that's why we have Auditor Dave Bullock as the administrative overseer of the State Board of Elections. We have Sam Hayes, a former general counsel to Tim Moore and Dustin Hall, as the executive director of the State Board of Elections. It's why the county boards of elections have shifted from 3-2 Democratic control to 3-2 Republican control. And all these things matter. Another thing that is impactful is this narrowing of the time for counting provisionals from 9 days after the election to 2.5 days after the election, which gives voters a lot less time if they forgot their ID to go back to the county elections board and bring that ID back. It makes it harder for campaigns to mobilize people who might have had some ballot secure, some registration issues to go back and address those. And I've seen some folks make the case that, is this coming back to bite Burger? I mean, that would kind of be a little bit of a leap because if you look at where these provisionals came from, it was overwhelmingly Rockingham. And Rockingham overwhelmingly swung in favor of Page over Burger. So there have been some people trying to say, would these Republicans regret these decisions they've made? I've not heard that regret so far. But the one thing that has come under question has been the impartiality of the state board. And we saw Auditor Bullock campaign for Burger. We saw Sam Hayes join a fundraiser for House Speaker Tim Moore. Both of them defend themselves, saying that that was an appropriate thing to do. Page has asked for Bullock to recuse himself. Bullock said that's not necessary because he's not really involved in the recounting of ballots or anything like that. So we still have some impartiality questions, but by all accounts, there has not been as many issues on the ground as people had thought, at least before March 3rd.
It's really interesting though, because the impartiality questions that I've been hearing here in Guilford are from Republicans, actually. They're from, sort of hardcore Republicans who are saying, all of this taking out, it's very interesting because I've been doing this for like 20 years and I've noticed that what happens is, when Democrats were in power, they were not interested in having a bipartisan or nonpartisan election board or election process or redistricting or any of that stuff. As soon as they were not in power, they were like, we must have a nonpartisan process. Republicans were saying that when they were in the wilderness for decades. They get into power and they make it even more partisan, and some of the folks who remember that and for whom it was, an ideological hill that they thought was worth dying on, they don't really care that their team is in power. They're worried that, if they back Sam Page, for instance, like, can there be even an impartial Republican primary if it ultimately gets decided either by, something that happens at the election board level, the state auditor who suddenly, after registering as a Republican to run for that office, has all of these powers put underneath him, or the North Carolina Supreme Court. If it goes there, how much confidence does anybody have that people are going to feel that that was a nonpartisan result?
And
In terms of sentiment, I think there is some heartburn to spread around.
And just to Joe's point really quick, because this could end up in the courts, we have a strong Republican majority on the Court of Appeals and the state Supreme Court. And if folks are curious, it could go to a 3-judge panel on the Court of Appeals. Who are members on the Court of Appeals? Jefferson Griffin from 2024. He's still a Court of Appeals judge, folks. Don't forget that. There's Tom Murray, who had donated to Griffin's legal expense fund. So he has expressed some willingness or support for trying to possibly overturn the election results in 2024. We also have Justice Phil Berger Jr. on the state Supreme Court. That might be a conflict of interest for folks. The biggest question I think that folks are missing is that there is Justice Richard Dietz, who was not on board with that Griffin v. Riggs challenge and the arguments Republicans made. If Berger recuses himself and if Dietz sides with with Page in a hypothetical scenario, then it would be the Court of Appeals ruling that matter. So not to get too far ahead of ourselves, but I think folks aren't looking at enough at the impact the state Court of Appeals could have.
Yeah, this is down the road though. We're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves. We should find out in the coming week or so whether we're looking at a recount. I wanted to jump to some of the questions in the chat, or sorry, I keep saying in the chat, and I mean in the Q&A. I apologize. The Q&A button is at the bottom of your screen, and I want to jump to some of those questions. And if we don't get to your question, we'll answer some of these in the newsletter. So you should subscribe to the newsletter. We got a question that I thought we've gotten several questions about unaffiliated voters and the rise in unaffiliated voters in North Carolina, their increase. And somebody asked if there's any indication from researchers or election analysts whether people are registering that way strategically so that they can participate in the most competitive primary or influence the opposite party primary or something like that, or if this is just another example of disillusionment with the party structure.
In Guilford County, up in the week before the election during early voting, something like 90% of unaffiliated ballots in District 26 were Republican ballots. Unaffiliated voters were picking Republican ballots. The Berger camp felt that they were doing well among those voters. They didn't think they were. They were actually surprised, I think, at how little Democrats were, at least in their sense of it, how little Democrats were messing around in the primary. They thought there was going to be more of a push by Democrats to register unaffiliated and sort of, meddle a little bit. Even though they made an ad about how Democrats were meddling, they were kind of surprised at how that wasn't really happening that much. In Rockingham County, the unaffiliateds were, as far as I understand it, they're very hardcore Trump people who hate the Republican Party because it's establishment, but they're very hardcore Trump people, and they went overwhelmingly for Page. So I don't know. Offhand, I don't know a lot of research about whether. I don't know of any research to that effect. But my understanding is I don't think people vote that strategically. I mean, I don't think there's a lot like most people who call themselves independents have a really have a partisan lean, and they vote in the same primary over and over again. There's very few people who vote in different primaries depending on the election.
Just to show the numbers and the visuals, just very quick for folks. If you look statewide at unaffiliated voters, you can see, at least for the early vote, this is statewide, about 56% were Democrats, 44% Republicans. That's kind of how unaffiliated skewed. Whereas if you look at the Berger-Page race, it was 69% Republican, 31% Democratic ballots among unaffiliated voters in that district. So some level of strategy, but mostly in these races where it's kind of obvious where you want your influence in a legislative race.
I spoke with Chris Cooper, who everyone is probably familiar with, the political scientist out to the west, about his book when it came out, and he told me that there's no. He said most unaffiliated voters are not swing voters, but almost all swing voters are unaffiliated voters. But he called them like shadow partisans, so they're registered unaffiliated, but they always vote one way or the other. And he described them as more unmoored people. Like unmoored voters are more interesting than unaffiliated voters because those are the ones who truly, like walk into a voting booth and might actually split a ticket, which is pretty rare. But I could see an argument for, if you live in one of these hyper partisan areas, the winner of the Democratic primary in Durham is going to win the general in Durham. So I could see a case for voting. That's the only way you're really going to have your voice heard. But I have not heard any intentional, meddling or anything like that.
Yeah, I mean, there actually is decades of academic research on this. I spoke to Jason Husser, who's a political scientist at Elon University and the head of the Elon poll out there. And, we were talking about how exactly what Chase said, that people who are unaffiliated generally vote exactly as they voted when they were affiliated, if they were affiliated. But even more often, people who are part of a party and they become unaffiliated are not doing that because they feel like their party is not, or not always doing that because they feel like the other party is closer to where they are. There are Democrats who are, sort of Bernie Sanders Democrats who are unaffiliated because they are, not because they're not liberal. They feel like the party's not liberal enough, and Republicans who are becoming unaffiliated because they feel like their party is not conservative enough. And those people are very unlikely to cross a line and, or split a ticket, to do that, even if, perhaps they don't love their options. And here in Guilford, Jeff was talking about how the Burger folks thought that they were going to do pretty well with the unaffiliated. And if there was any, playing around, people who were actually Democrats or actually left-leaning were voting in Republican primaries. But the truth is, here in Guilford County, there weren't a whole lot of like really competitive Republican primaries. There was the primary for sheriff, and like that was about it. And so I think it's a better test somewhere where you have some more competitive primaries on both sides, to know whether or not people are gonna, do that.
All right, we are right at an hour, so we are going to let everyone go. But as Kate just said in the chat, one more nudge to please sign up for the caucus. If you stuck with us for 1 hour of talking about primaries, you will love our twice a week newsletter about North Carolina politics. We will answer some of the questions that we didn't get to in the newsletter at some point coming up. And also, if you think of a question that you didn't have a chance to put in the Q&A, I'm putting our email address in the chat. I promise we read every single one of these emails, and usually either Bryan or I will respond. So please let us know, send us your feedback, send us your questions. We love to hear from you. Thanks so much for taking an hour of your time to talk with us.